Well, good morning. Welcome to Oklahoma. Glad everyone's here, and I look forward to interacting through the week. I want to thank everyone involved, Dale especially. I've been following Dale since I was a skinny young kid in West Texas, and Dave and Dwayne for organizing this session. They gave me this title and a charge to sort of bring this discussion of fire back to the Society for Range Management, and it sounded like a fairly easy thing to do until I started actually working on this. But start out with this title is kind of interesting. So in my mind, that's actually kind of a ridiculous question, because rangelands are things that burn. That would be my definition. So you can't have the alternative to this being a central tenet. But I'll live with Dave and Dwayne's title and move on and try to approach that. We've seen a lot of iconic images. This is this organization's iconic image of the Trail Boss by Charlie Russell, and it represents sort of a view of what sustainable management of rangelands may be. At least it's the one we put forth to people across the country. It's often, it's caused some controversy in the past. Personally, I actually love the painting. I love the image. I do think it's part of our history. I don't think it's complete image. And in fact, grew up in Texas, so spent the first half of my life just dreaming of being that guy on that horse. And as I've gotten older, kind of held on to that dream, at least partially, but it has gradually changed. It's gotten a little bit more difficult to interpret, and perhaps a little scary in some cases. But it's actually a bit of a farce to present that as sort of a trail boss versus fire fanatic. That's actually not very productive. That's actually one of the problems that we faced, is you're either in one culture or another. And it's interesting that Dave and Dwayne asked me to give this talk and to talk specifically about grazing and fire as central tenets of this discipline, because I've had the opportunity to travel around and speak at different meetings. I go to grazing related meetings, and they often call me the fire dude, or at least politely to my face, that's what they call me. I go to fire meetings and they call me the grazing person. So hopefully as I discuss this, I'll express my opinions of where this discipline should go, but maybe I'll also figure out what I should do. What I want to talk about is sustainable management of rangelands, which I think is what this organization is about. And I want to specifically address 4 questions. Can we sustainably manage rangelands without fire? I'll talk briefly about that. Is the rangeland community focused mostly on grazing? Are we giving sufficient attention to fire? And then finally, is this sort of dichotomous discussion of fire versus grazing actually a legitimate thing, or are there alternative things that we can talk about? So I'll start with the first question. Can we sustainably manage rangelands without fire? I'm sure all of you know that my bias is no, we can't, so maybe I should just sit down. But in reality, this is an image from, I believe sometime in July, off of my iPad, looking at active fire incidents across the U.S. And so we can ignore fire, or try to ignore fire, but it's basically going to happen. And I think this is important because I've recently read new approaches to managing rangelands. Like one interesting one is the sage grouse approach, which is basically, according to some people, it's one of fire suppression entirely, and then when we fail at fire suppression, we try to reseed. That's not very engaging from a fire ecology standpoint, from a system that is actually very prone to fire. if you look at this image, and if that's our goal, and if that's what's required to save sage grouse, we're going to lose sage grouse. I want to use as an example one of my favorite places in the world and data from that place. This is from the Sonora Experiment Station in Texas, semi-arid savanna, and this is the long-term number of animals on the Sonora station. This is not the picture of sustainable management of rangelands. In fact, it's quite the contrary. Basically, this is, in my mind, this is a microcosm of our discipline. What happened on the Sonora station is a reflection of the Society for Range Management in more ways than one. It's actually complex why this has changed so much. It started in the early 1900s as an animal science station, was very heavily stocked, way overstocked. In fact, the pictures are mostly of rocks. And so obviously some of that initial decline in numbers of animals is due to that. By 1948, about the time this profession officially started, we saw the range community take over this station. So now the experts are here and we're going to stop this declining animal productivity. We studied grazing systems, we studied rotational resting, we studied all kinds of things associated with grazing. We studied grass, tillering, grass basal area, grass cover, grass diversity. All the while, productivity of this landscape continued to degrade. Basically what was happening was we were losing the grassland areas within a woodland. Now I was fortunate, working with Butch Taylor and others, to be able to take long-term data from the station, develop a model so that we could go back in time and do what-if scenarios and see what would have happened if we would have changed what we had done on this landscape. And this particular graph shows really probably what happened, and that is no fire, and it really doesn't matter whether it's grazed or not, frankly. You're going to see this same pattern. So initially, variability in productivity was driven by weather. Over enough time, it became entirely driven by woody plant abundance and lack of fire. So on the left side of that graph, grazing management was an important topic. By the time you got to the middle, about 60 years later, grazing management did not matter one bit. This landscape had converted from a fairly open grassland or savanna to a woodland. Now, an alternative scenario was a 10-year fire return interval that we would have maintained for 150 years, which would have sustained the potential production off of that landscape for 150 years. So from a long-term perspective, and I think Butch would agree, grazing management, the only reason grazing management matters is because it's a way that you can help put fire in the ground. The most important thing is to maintain fire in this ecosystem. So you might not be interested in livestock. You might be interested in conservation, other topics, and I frequently study biodiversity related issues, and sort of the poster child within this region for the biodiversity topics now is the lesser prairie chicken, which will probably be listed in the next few months on the endangered species list. Lots of people think that farming has caused this species to decline, and certainly farming has played a role. Its historical range actually goes all the way down to the Sonora Experiment Station. This is a bird that requires open grasslands. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the lower half of that historical range, but there's not a prairie in that region. It's all woodland. And it turns out that I frequently argue about the lesser prairie chicken, that the primary cause historically and in the future of the decline is probably the increase in mesquite and eastern or juniper of different species. And we have studies that actually confirm it. Another quick example, thanks to Wade Harrell, whooping cranes foraging in a recently burned area. There's examples all over North America and the world of wildlife species that are highly dependent upon recently burned areas. Now that said, there are also studies from all over the world where there are wildlife species that are dependent upon unburned areas or areas that haven't been burned for quite some time. Again, suggesting the need for this mosaic that everyone has referred to. So generally speaking, I realize that was just one example, but I actually think that it's a slam dunk that you cannot sustainably manage rangelands for a long period of time without attention to fire regimes. So the next question, is the rangeland community focused mostly on grazing? We can start by just reflecting back on the trail boss as an image to begin with. That's the primary aspect within that. You can also look at the principles of range management. The principles of range management, as frequently stated, and as I joke that we're all supposed to have tattooed on our left butt cheek, they actually are all about grazing. We can also ask, how do we determine range condition or ecosystem condition of rangelands, if you prefer? Well, we all know that the historical approach of doing this for rangelands up until the 90s was based on Dijksterhouse's range condition method that was entirely based on grazing. Bad things that happen on rangelands were driven by grazing, and removal of grazing or reduction of grazing are what can cause them to recover. We've changed that. We don't use that anymore as a model, and one of the primary reasons we don't use it is because grazing doesn't cause everything, and removal of grazing will not allow it to recover. For example, the increase in woody plants. We all know grazing is not frequently the dominant cause of that, and we certainly know that removal of grazing won't cause it to recover. I think we know that. So we don't use that method anymore. We have a new method, ecological site descriptions, and rangeland health and so forth, based on state and transition models. These, most of you are well familiar with them. They're based on expert opinion. So it is a good reflection of what this organization thinks. One of the reasons that we switched to ecological site descriptions was this issue with grazing, but it was also the need of being able to assess nationally what the conditions of rangelands are. With a couple of the best postdocs in the country, at least two of the best postdocs in the country, Drac Twidwell and Brady Allred, we undertook lately actually assessing ecological site descriptions from a national perspective. And this was not very easy to do. The current setup for acquiring this knowledge is not a point-and-click technology. And basically, poor Drac had to go through 789 ecological site descriptions and fill out a database, create a new database. Then we had to translate it back into maps so that we could map it. But this is some of the kind of output we can get. What were the historical plant communities? So all of this is based, for those of you that don't know, there's a center of this reference plant community. The historical plant community is often what's discussed. So the first question we were able to ask is, What are the dominant historical plant communities? What do we think rangelands looked like historically? And it comes out a strong dominance for grasslands. So you see the yellow color up there. That's a grassland landscape. Next are mixes between shrub mix, tree mix. There are very few shrublands or forest, at least according to the ecological site descriptions. More importantly, the kinds of questions we can now ask with this data are what are the primary changes that are being described on rangelands throughout North America. So these figures all show the same color pattern. It's the percent land area within a major land resource area that have this particular ecological factor as a dominant feature. So the first two dominant changes occurring on rangelands, one is woody reduction, the other is woody encroachment. And so these are state and transition models, and that of course depends on which way you're going in the model. So the dominant features that are occurring on our landscapes, the kinds of changes that are occurring, are mostly associated with woody plants. The bottom one is less than 60%. That's actually the old Dijkster house sort of change in composition, herbaceous composition. But even more importantly, we can actually ask, what are the primary drivers in these models that cause these changes? Grazing, by far, is still the dominant driver. So while we like to criticize Dijkster House for focusing too much on grazing, we're still focusing a lot on grazing. Second, though, a positive from this session's perspective is that fire is recognized within this community as being very important. In fact, it comes out at a very close second. Third, then, is brush management. And I'll talk a little more about these later. But from this perspective, this is still fairly esoteric and hard to actually understand what it's calling for in terms of management. So this table, which is a little more complex, we focused on what is required to restore an ecosystem, a rangeland ecosystem that has had degradation occur. So for example, if you look on the left, those are changes that are required to restore an ecosystem. So you either have to kill trees, cause herbaceous shifts, eradicate exotic plants, or reverse erosion. Along the top, we have drivers or management actions that can actually cause those directional changes. So if we go through these, the dominant effect on rangelands of increasing woody plants and restoring those back are driven, 90% of those can be accomplished through grazing, or at least grazing is a part of it. Now it also has brush management as a high priority. Fire is only 60% of the time considered a useful tool. Reversing undesirable shifts in plants, it's dominantly grazing still. Fire is about 40%. Sometimes these overlap, so it gets a little confusing to actually explain why, say, brush management occurs within herbaceous shifts, and a lot of it has to do with sometimes you have two kinds of transitions occurring at the same time. Eradicating an exotic invader, and this is actually eradicating. The most frequent method is grazing. Reversing erosion. 73% of the time this is possible through grazing. So we're basically still using the Dijkster House model largely. Grazing is the dominant feature in these models, just like it was in the old methodology of doing range condition. Now grazing can control woody plants, but it's not usually the grazing that we're talking about on rangelands of North America. By the way, that elephant happens to be grazing in a burned savanna, just for future reference. In addition to looking at the ecological site descriptions, we can bring in John Tanaka's economic data on what we've actually spent money on through the NRCS on conservation, and combine that with the ecological site data. So for example, grazing. 71% of the models have grazing as an important feature. 24% of the money conservation money goes to managing grazing, and 55% of the land area has grazing applied to it. Brush management is a really interesting one, especially standing on this stage. And we're talking about basically chemical and mechanical control. Brush management is important in 55% of the models, gets 66% of the money, but only occurs on 3% of the land. 66% of the money, only at 3% of the land. So essentially it's having no national impact on rangeland ecosystems, but it's getting the majority of the money, maybe having a local impact. Well, what about fire? Occurs in 62% of the models, gets 1% of the money, and 1% of it's applied to 1% of the land. So I would argue that we are a grazing-centric organization, followed by brush control, and we have insufficiently discussed fire. But let me summarize this quick review of a national assessment of ecological site descriptions. They suggest we're still focused on grazing, but we do have this increased appreciation of fire within the discipline. We're just not applying any of it. There are still just as many unrealistic predictions from grazing as there was in Dijksterhuis's model. The money through NRCS suggests that there's absolutely no focus on fire whatsoever, and I would argue that the other agencies, other than suppression, would support this as well. Brush management has minimal national impact, 3% of the land, but gets 2/3 of the money. And then to transition, what else do we know about fire research? I recently completed the Conservation Effects Assessment Program for prescribed burning as a practice with other colleagues. And this is a graph from that showing the numbers of papers as on rangeland and fire over time, showing this exponential increase. So we're recognizing in the literature that this is an important issue. And actually, just as a side note, a major portion of these papers are within our society. Also, there happens to be an entirely independent, for the most part, approach to evaluating rangeland ecosystems as well as other kinds of ecosystems that has already been developed for the entire U.S. And this is land fire. And it's based on state and transition models. And it's a little more friendly from the point and click standpoint because you can actually do more of a national assessment. But the main point here is what they've concluded is that 3/4 of U.S. lands dominated by native plants in the U.S. are moderate or highly departed from reference conditions because of altered fire regimes. So while we're focusing on fire, on grazing, national assessments actually point to the fact that we actually should be giving a lot more attention to fire. I knew there would be a lot of pictures, paintings in this session, and I actually tried to predict what would be used. And I expected there would be a picture of Bambi and the deers running from fire, but no one used that. Maybe it's copyrighted. But I was going to use this one as sort of the alternative vision, because I think we've mostly thought of animals running from fire and terror, but we're gradually learning through a lot of research that animals and fire coexist. They actually, in many cases, may be very comfortable associated with fire. And I particularly like this painting because it ties back to my primary research interest. And many of you have heard me talk about this over the years, some of you probably too much. But I argue that what rangelands are is an expression of the fire-grazing interaction. That's what they were historically, and if we want to manage them now, and sustain them, that's what I would argue is required. This model sort of suggests that spatial variability across the landscape is central, largely driven by the fire-grazing interaction, which also drives fire and grazing across the landscape. So it's sort of self-perpetuating. And that this is what makes rangelands rangelands. It's what makes them diverse. It makes them function, if you will, the way rangelands operate. The net effect is that grazing animals are highly attracted to fire. And in fact, I like to always say that if they were in charge of the fire program, the world would look very different. We're probably lucky they don't have thumbs and can carry a drip torch. But generally speaking, counter to the Bambi, everything fleeing, these are cows in Stillwater that seem to be pretty accepting. I don't think they actually lit this fire, but I'm not sure. So these are bison at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve grazing on a recently burned patch. We've studied this sort of attraction by grazing animals from British Columbia to Texas, and I personally have studied bison, cattle, stockers, cows, horses, elk, but the literature's full of examples. Kangaroos throughout the region. And we've actually done these studies from 100 acres up to land that's essentially borderless. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because many of you have already seen it. I am going to try and see if I can get this to work. In fact, I will briefly summarize what we found from a range management perspective based on our research over the last 10 or 15 years. But I first want to mention this photograph. This is Sonia Leverkus is here from British Columbia, and this is one of her prescribed fires up in the Boreal region that she works with outfitters and First Nations people. And the intent is to sort of restore this fire grazing interaction. When we restore the fire grazing interaction, actually when we let them interact, we don't even have to restore them. We just have to stop making them not interact. We find that the animals are highly attracted to the recently burned areas, largely because of enhanced forage quality. Nitrogen cycling becomes highly dependent upon spatial variability and associated patterns of herbivores and fires. We found reduced invasion of ecosystems because the herbivores are less selective on individual plants and more selective at the patch level. Emily Hyatt is here, and she'll be presenting this week a study where we actually looked at use of riparian areas when you allow an animal to graze patchy fires in a landscape versus one that has no fires. 5 times the riparian use without fire. So they're less focused on riparian areas and more focused on a burn patch. Maintained or enhanced livestock production, less pests on domestic livestock. And then, as I argue, this is the basis for biodiversity. Different species live in different patches. You create a diverse environment. Now, when I first started this study, and actually continually as I go around, the number one thing people say is, well, that's really interesting, but it doesn't work here. You know, you're in the plains. And one of the things I like about today's session is they highlight that this is not only in the Great Plains, it's not only in North America, this is a global process. Brady already found that this attraction to fire by herbivores is a dominant feature in every continent except for Antarctica, according to the literature. And from small mammals to elephants. So we're not talking about a local feature. So I'm almost out of time. I'll try and conclude really quickly and make a few dominant points here. I would argue strongly, and I'm happy to discuss it, especially if you buy me a beer, altered fire regimes are the dominant driver of state changes on rangelands. It's not grazing, it's altered fire regimes. Grazing may be involved in that, but the primary change that's occurred on our landscapes is altered fire regimes. Our discipline has been very grazing centric, and that's not entirely bad, but we also do have some leaders in fire ecology within our discipline. Fire and grazing should be considered interactive rather than competing ideas. They're interacting across space and time. We should embrace the complexity associated with those and consider them actually one disturbance, is what I've argued in the past. This pyrrhic herbivory, they're inseparable. That's not true because we've separated them, but they should be inseparable. Brush management is not a surrogate for fire. One of the problems is we viewed fire as a tool rather than a critical ecological process that's a part of rangeland systems. When you decide that it's a tool, then it's replaceable by another tool. It is not replaceable by herbicides. There's plenty of literature on that. They can do some similar things, but they are not the same thing. A suppression model is basically what we're still operating on from a management context. And I would argue that we should replace this with a model where we make sure systems can absorb fire, because we're not going to suppress them. Short-term studies, small plots, this is one of my pet peeves. From the SEEP report, the vast majority of the research is from less than an acre and less than 3 years. We're not going to understand complex fires on complex landscapes by studying small plots for a short period of time. I like the 3 years because I'm a little out of shape to be crawling around on my hands and knees around sampling plots, so I'd rather hire graduate students. But if we actually want to have an impact and understand these processes on landscapes, we need to do larger scale studies. And then finally, just one final point. It's very trendy now to study socio-ecological systems. That's what fire has always been, and that's what fire is now. And I'll sort of conclude with this slide from Drac Twidwell and Butch Taylor and John Weir put this together, focusing on burning cooperatives. These are landowners helping landowners conduct prescribed burns. And this is being done in spite of the fact that there's no support within the NRCS funding, or very little. So in spite of the fact that there's very little funding for it, it actually is still being applied across the landscape. And then one final point. The bottom left there is the Sonora experiment station. And we focused on grasslands and grazing and looked up one day and it was a forest. So now we're talking about, oh no, we should have recognized that. Well, look at all of that to the top right. Those are fairly recent oil patch. So we're basically changing from a grassland to a woodland, and the next step may be an industrial landscape, even though it's very rural. And with that, I'll conclude.
Bring the lights up, please. Any questions for Dr. Fuller?